Welcome back to Serger Tip Clips. In the previous tip clip, I showed you how to eliminate loops hanging off straight edges. Well, today we're going to conquer the curve, and this is very exciting. I'm going to show you how to go from this as a result to this. You can see the loops are hugging the edge even at the steepest part of the curve. And this does take a little bit of practice, sometimes even a little bit more than a little bit of practice, depending. But what I like to do if I have a curve and I think it's going to be challenging, I like to cut out multiple sample pieces with the exact same curve on it and practice until I get all of my settings correct and I really get a feel for how to maneuver and manipulate the fabric under the presser foot. And not only does this give me good practice, but it builds in muscle memory into my hands for how to handle the fabric correctly. And there are some things that you definitely want to do and other things that you don't want to do. So practicing ahead of time really will pay off. And I know I sound probably like somebody's mother when they told them to practice the piano or whatever else they were doing as children, but practice really and truly does make perfect. And be patient with yourself. I never got a curve looking great until maybe the 100th one I did. So I'm sure you'll do better than that. But it took me a long time to get everything all figured out. In fact, most of the time in my tip clips, when I put the fabric under the presser foot, I speed up the video just to move it through. And in this one, because operator technique is so important, I'm going to be leaving the video at the same speed that I'm actually stitching at, because I want you to see how my hands move the fabric under the presser foot. Oftentimes with a curve, because the knife is in front of where the needle is going to stitch, you have to straighten the curve out so that you don't cut right into the middle of your fabric. And you want to learn the fundamentals of straightening the curve without stretching it. You don't want to create a longer edge than what was intentional or intended from your pattern. So watching my hands and how I maneuver the fabric is really important. Also, I'm using a clear foot on the machine, and there are two good reasons for that. Number one, a clear foot gives me very good vision on what the fabric is doing under the presser foot, but a clear foot won't grab and hold the fabric quite as firmly as a metal foot will. So it makes it easier to maneuver the fabric around under it. And while we're talking about that, I've lightened my presser foot pressure. My lever for doing that is right here. If you're not sure whether that feature is available on your machine, pull out your owner's manual and see if you can adjust the presser foot pressure. I brought mine down 1 notch from the default setting of 4. Mine is set on 3. Now, a few other things that are important to know: that you want to stitch slowly. If you have the option of putting the needle down on your machine, definitely engage that feature. When you pause to maneuver the fabric, having the needle down will eliminate a skip stitch or at least help eliminate it. And it'll keep the fabric where you want it to be. And also, you're going to stitch slowly. Don't be afraid to pause multiple times. Even on a short curve like this, you'll see how many times I paused to get the fabric just right. Slowing down will actually save you time, because you don't spend time ripping out an undesirable result just to redo and redo and redo. So again, just take your time and you'll be much happier with the way it comes out. Now, that said, I am stitching on a single layer of quilting weight cotton batik fabric. The number of layers that you're stitching on, as well as the thickness of the fabric, can affect how you are going to adjust the settings that I talk about on my machine. So keep that in mind. You might not necessarily have the exact same settings that I do if you're stitching on something that has multiple layers and is a little bit bulkier under the presser foot. And there's nothing wrong with changing those as long as you get a good result. That is key. So also one other key element is total stitch control. And I do have that with my Bernina L890. I love this machine. I am able to adjust the tensions. I can adjust the stitch width down to within a fraction of a millimeter, as well as having the all-important MTC dial. The MTC dial is the micro thread control, and that can change the width of the loops that are created with the upper and lower looper. So if I had a very thick, bulky fabric and a double layer, say of sweatshirt fleece, polar fleece, I'd probably turn that MTC dial to a positive number, +1 or 2. But because I'm using a single layer and quilting cotton is fairly light, I'm going to be turning it down to a negative number. And that's going to help snug up those loops on the edge. And that's why, even again at the steepest part, they are sitting smoothly against the edge of that fabric. So we'll go to the machine. I'll talk about that as I am doing my samples, and you'll see a couple of different settings with the MTC dial as a point of comparison with this. Before I stitch my samples, I want to go over a couple of the things that I mentioned in the first Serger Tip clip about loops hanging off the edge. This is my knife, and here is my stitch finger, and they are aligned with each other. I've taken the presser foot off so that we'll have a clear view. And in just a second, I'm going to turn my machine around so that you can see that and see exactly how I'm going to position the fabric. But also, one other thing that I want to bring your attention to while I have this angle, and I'm going to bring my camera down just a little bit, is my trusty MTC dial. And most of the time, I have it on the neutral setting of 0. But there are times when I've done reverse flat locking when I want to widen out the stitch a little bit and move that stitch finger out to the right as much as possible. So I'll turn this up to a +2. But today, because I'm working on a curve, and typically it's very difficult to get the curves to, or get the loops to hug the curves, I'm going to go in the negative direction to shorten those loops and narrow down the width a little bit. So I'm going to try it on a -1 and a -2 for comparison's sake. So let me turn my machine around and we'll take a look at exactly what that MTC dial is doing with the stitch finger. Now we're looking head on at the machine. This is the top of my knife, and here's my stitch finger. I have my stitch width dial set on 6. It's also the cutting width dial because, as you'll see, the knife and the stitch finger move exactly at the same rate with each other. And that means that my knife is always in the correct placement for the width of the stitch that I've chosen, right down to a fraction of a millimeter. So let me show you that. I'm going to move these out right, which would widen my stitch. So let's take a look. And you can see the knife and stitch finger moving out. Now it's at 9 millimeters, the widest stitch in overlock mode. And let's bring it back to 6 again, and you'll see them both move together. And that's so important to make sure that your knife is cutting at the correct width for the width of the stitch that you've selected. Some older models of sergers may have separate controls for moving your knife and stitch finger. And it makes it a little bit trickier to get the knife in the correct position and make sure it's not cutting off either too much or too little fabric for that width of stitch. But consult your owner's manual if you have a machine that does that. Also, after I did the last video, I had some people ask me about their machines and saying that they could not adjust their stitch finger. And that is the case with certain sergers, that some of them have a stationary stitch finger that you can't change the width of the stitch. So you just go with that, and it'll still probably work okay. So I've got the presser foot off, and I'm going to put the presser foot down even though there's no presser foot on it, so that I can take a few stitches, and we'll review how those loops hold on to the stitch finger, and that's where they're formed over that stitch finger. Okay, I'm not going to remove those stitches or pull them off the stitch finger, just as a review to see that those loops do form around the stitch finger, and then the needle thread catches it on the left side. So our aim is to keep that curve, and this is a little trickier than the straight edge that we did in the previous tip clip, but we want to keep that right on top of the tip of the stitch finger. So let's take a look at that. Before we stitch on our fabric, I just want to review a little bit about what the MTC dial is. MTC stands for Micro Thread Control. And this is the beauty of having total stitch control on a machine, because this is a fine-tuning device on the machine that allows us to really almost microscopically get our stitch exactly the way we want it to. So I have my stitch width on 6 right now, but if I wanted to snug up those looper threads and pull that stitch finger in just a little bit, I could turn my micro thread control or MTC dial down to a negative number. Right now I have it on the neutral 0, so I want you to watch the stitch finger, and I'm going to turn it down to -1. And you can see it move in just a smidge closer. So it's going to narrow down those loops. And then if I needed a little more to bring those loops to the edge of the fabric, I could bring it back down to -2. So let's take a look at that. So again, just a tiny bit, but just enough to keep those loops hugging the edge of the fabric. But while we're here and talking about it, I might as well show you in the plus direction too. So let's bring that back to 0. And this is what you've seen me do with reverse flat locking when I really want to go as absolutely wide as the machine will allow me. I'm going to bring this up to a +2. Right now we're on +1. You can see it moving out still, and now up to +2. So that is another fine-tuning device on the machine that is going to allow us to really get picture-perfect results with stitching on a curve or even a straight edge. One other thing that I should have mentioned while I was moving that stitch finger with the MTC dial is that the stitch finger moves independently of the knife with the MTC dial. The MTC dial only will move the stitch finger. It won't change the cutting width. So that's an important distinction between the MTC dial and the cutting stitch width dial. Let's go to the machine and start stitching. Just to give you my setup, I have set for stitch number 3, which is a 3-thread wide overlock stitch. I have the left needle in, upper and lower loopers, all threaded with serger cone thread. My stitch length is on 2.5, my stitch width is on 6, and right now I have my MTC micro thread control dial on 0, the neutral setting. You can see my finger right down here with that. So let's stitch and see how this looks. Now, sometimes I speed up the video while I'm stitching, but I'm going to leave it on the normal speed, which is going to take longer to go through. But the important thing that I want you to see is how I handle the fabric. Because we're working on a curve, you're not on the straight of grain for most of the time until I hit the dead center of that curve. And I want to be careful not to stretch the fabric. That is so critical. And think about it when you are doing necklines and it ends up being sagging and gaping when you wear it. I've pulled my camera out just a little bit so that you can really see what my fingers are doing and what the fabric is doing in front of the presser foot. When you're stitching a curve, operator technique is absolutely critical to make sure that you don't stretch the edge of the curve and thus distort the final dimension. But also, you just want to use light fingers and hands as you go along while you're pushing the fabric and straightening it without stretching it. That is critical. So I'm going to put this down. And one of the reasons I should say that people have trouble with an inside curve, a concave curve, is that as you're going into the deepest part of the curve, the fabric tends to kind of shift away from where the knife is and where the stitch finger is. And that's one of the reasons that we have loops hanging off. So let's take a look at that in action. Put the foot down. Now this one will probably not be perfect, but I'm going to show you how to make it perfect. And I stop periodically, and I can even have my needle down when I stop so that I don't accidentally shift. And you can see my fingers pushing this along. I still am straightening it, but I'm giving myself enough slack in the fabric in front of the presser foot so that I'm not stretching it. And you notice how now, and it's a little bit hard to see because I pulled this out, but as I've gotten to the deepest part of the curve, that is not right on top of my stitch finger. I'm going to go over and give this a quick press so that we can put it on the table and really see it, because this thread is light colored and it doesn't contrast with the white on the machine. So let's turn the MTC dial down to -1 and see if that helps. And I've brought my stitch finger in a little bit closer to the needle, and that should help somewhat. And I'm going to do the same exact technique with my fingers and the fabric. And you can see the knife is barely cutting off anything, just skimming off a few little whiskers here and there. I'm going to press this and we'll take a look at this on the table. Let's make one more adjustment and bring the MTC dial down to -2. So that's going to shorten those loops left to right a little bit more than the -1 and see if we get perfect results with that. I'll press this and we'll check this out and compare it on the table. Here's sample number 1 with the MTC dial on 0, the neutral setting. And you can see we have some loops starting here. It looks pretty good right through here, not bad at all. The steepest part of the curve, which is the trickiest part, you can definitely see those loops hanging off. And a little bit over here, and then it looks not too bad again over at the end of the curve. So that's the first one. Now let's look at the second one. It's better. I've turned the MTC dial down to -1 or -1, and it looks excellent right up until here. And then again, as we hit that steep part of the curve, you can see that those loops are kind of loose and hanging off the edges of that part of the curve. And then it looks pretty darn good right at the end, the last couple of inches, but still not exactly what we're looking for a beautiful finish. So now let's take a look at our third sample. This is with my MTC dial turned down to -2. So I've narrowed down those loops even a little bit more, and look at the results. Beautiful all the way around. And even at the steep part of the curve, again, the trickiest part, absolutely beautiful. The loops are right on the edge of the fabric. It's just exactly what I'm looking for, right from beginning to end. So once you understand these different components on your machine and aren't afraid to play around with them and do some trial runs, then you'll be in great shape for getting perfect results on the next curve that you do. I'll be anxious to hear from you and how your curves are coming out, and I hope you're seeing a big improvement with some of these tips and tricks that I showed you today. If you have any comments or questions, drop them below. I'll get back to you quickly with an answer. Thanks for joining me. Happy sewing and serging.